This is an existential threat. This is where states use nuclear weapons.
Do you foresee a scenario in the world where the West and the East will be completely separated economically, technologically? There will be very, very limited trade, like as during the Cold War era.
Tell me what you mean by the West and the East. I mean,
The West mostly driven by the US and the East led by China. I had a previous question to that, but partly maybe your presentation answered that. That was, if the US considers China as a peer competitor, wouldn't it make sense for the US to have a strong ally in form of Europe, and not weaken them against the Russia conflict when China is the real peer competitor?
Good. I should have understood your question to begin with. Let me start by saying that if you're the United States of America and you're in a multipolar world, and China is a peer competitor and a potential regional hegemon, and Russia is a weak great power, it's in your interest to have Russia as an ally, okay? And what the United States should be doing is it should be minimizing the forces that it has in Europe and forming an alliance with Russia so that Russia is part of the balancing coalition against China. That's what we should have done. But instead, what has happened is we have picked a fight with the Russians. The Russians are now a mortal enemy, and we have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and we have gotten more deeply involved militarily in Europe than was the case during the unipolar moment. This is at a time when we should be pivoting to Asia. You know, all the emphasis the Americans put on pivoting to Asia. It's very hard to pivot to Asia when you're increasing your commitment in Europe. So we're increasing our commitment in Europe, and we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This gets to your question. I think that what's happening here is we are, for the foreseeable future, moving to a world where you have the Russians and the Chinese on one side, the Iranians and the North Koreans as others, and others as well, right? And then on the other side, you have the Americans, the West Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Australians, the so-called West. So I think you are getting, I wouldn't have thought to call it an East-West divide, but that's a good term. You are getting something of an East-West divide here. And remember what we were talking about with regarding to economic intercourse in Europe. It looks like Russian-European economic intercourse is going to dry up in large part in the years ahead. It's already happening, which would just reinforce the point that I'm making. So I think, yeah, this is what's happening. And I think from an American point of view, it's not in our interest, because again, it would be in our interest to have an alliance with the Russians. By the way, just look at the Iranians. The Americans have this thing about Iran where we constantly, right, talk about how evil the Iranians are. We're unwilling to, reach any form of meaningful agreement with them, and so forth and so on. And what we've in effect done with the Iranians is driven them into the arms of the Russians. The Russians are getting all sorts of drones and ballistic missiles from the Iranians that are invaluable in their war in Ukraine. And that's because the Iranians have a vested interest in working with the Russians, because the Americans have their gun sights on Iran. I don't think that's smart either.